The morning Lydia Langley rode onto the stone ranch outside of Laramie, Wyoming, the sky was still bruised purple at the edges, and the mud on her boots had already dried into a second skin, cracked and brown and honest as the land itself. She had not sent a letter ahead. She had not asked permission. She had simply heard in the town of Cheyenne, from a broad-shouldered freight hauler named Denny Howell, that Clayton Stone was losing calves faster than he could count, and that he had run off his last two ranch hands over some disagreement involving a broke fence line and a missing mule, and that he was neck-deep in the worst calving season the Wyoming Territory had seen in a decade. Denny Howell had laughed when he told her, slapping his knee like it was the funniest thing going, and Lydia had listened carefully and thought that it sounded less like a funny story and a whole lot more like an opportunity. She was 24 years old in the spring of 1882, and she had been working cattle in one form or another since she was tall enough to grip a rope without it dragging her off her feet. Her father, Gerald Langley, had run a modest operation down in the Colorado Territory before a bad winter and a worse business partner had stripped the land from him and left the family with nothing but a wagon and a sense of stubborn pride so deep it had become structural, like bone. Gerald had died 2 years back from pneumonia he refused to acknowledge until it was far too late, and Lydia's mother, Ruth, had gone to live with her sister in Denver. And suddenly Lydia had found herself 22 years old, entirely free of obligation and entirely broke, which was a combination that made a person either collapse or decide to become formidable. Lydia had chosen formidable. She had worked a season in Colorado, a season in Montana, and spent the fall of 1881 helping a sheep operation outside of Casper that she never admitted to anyone because cattlemen did not take kindly to that kind of association. She had learned every corner of the business, from pulling calves in the dark hours before dawn to reading weather in the clouds 2 days out. She was not looking for a husband. She was not looking for rescue. She was looking for work that paid fair and a situation that didn't insult her intelligence. And from everything Denny Howell had accidentally told her, Clayton Stone's ranch sounded like exactly that kind of desperate. The ranch came into view around the bend of a wide, brown creek, a solid house built from squared timber, a long barn that had weathered well, 3 smaller outbuildings scattered with the casual logic of a man who had built things as he needed them rather than all at once. The corrals were pine rail and looked recently reinforced. There was smoke from the chimney and the sound, unmistakable even at this distance, of a calf bawling its displeasure to the world. Lydia urged her mare, a solid grulla named Petra, into a trot up the last stretch of road. The road itself was more suggestion than fact at this point, churned to dark ribbons by hooves and wagon wheels, and the slow, inevitable drama of spring mud. She had already ridden through the worst of it a mile back in her boots, her trousers, the lower 6 inches of her coat. All of it had taken a generous coating of Wyoming spring earth, which she figured was only appropriate given where she was going and what she intended to do when she got there. She saw him before he saw her. He was coming out of the barn with the posture of a man who had not slept in 2 days and intended to keep going regardless. He was tall, genuinely tall, not just the kind of tall that happened when a man wore a good hat, and broad through the shoulders in a way that looked functional rather than ornamental. He was wearing a canvas work coat that had seen better years and carrying a bucket in each hand, and there was something on his forearms that Lydia, from a distance, decided to interpret as birth fluid rather than investigate too closely. His hat was pushed back at an angle that suggested he had pushed it back sometime in the night and not thought about it since. He was, she guessed, somewhere close to 30, maybe 31 or 2, with the kind of weathered face that the Wyoming sun produced in men who worked outdoors and didn't worry about shelter. He set the buckets down when he heard Petra's hooves and straightened up with the kind of alertness that came from being the only person responsible for everything. His eyes, even at this distance, were sharp. Lydia pulled up at the fence line and looped her reins over the post with the practiced ease of someone who did not need to think about the action. "Clayton Stone," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, not rude, just measuring. His gaze traveled from her face to her rolled sleeves to the state of her boots and back up again in a way that was entirely practical, the way a man looked at a horse before buying it, checking for soundness. "That's right," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, unhurried, like a man who had trained himself not to waste words. "I heard you need help," Lydia said. "Calving crew went short. I know cattle. I know calving. I've pulled over 100 heads myself, and I don't spook easy, and I work clean." She paused. "My name is Lydia Langley." He looked at her again. There was something in his expression that moved through several things in quick succession: surprise, assessment, resistance, recalculation, and then landed somewhere that wasn't quite any of those. "You start today," he said. He picked up both his buckets and walked back toward the barn, and after a beat, Lydia unhitched Petra and followed him. The barn was warm with the collective heat of animals, and smelled of hay and lantern oil, and that particular sharp, clean smell that accompanied new life arriving into the world with no concern for convenience. There were 12 cows in the calving stalls, and 3 of them were clearly working through the early stages of labor, restless and shifting, their sides heaving with the slow, irregular rhythm of effort. A calf no more than a few hours old stood in the far corner, wobbling on legs that hadn't gotten the message yet about how legs were supposed to work, pressing its nose against its mother's flank with a faith that was almost unbearable to look at directly. Clayton Stone set the buckets down near the water trough and hung a fresh lantern on the hook near the main beam without turning around. "First heifer on the left has been at it since midnight," he said. "She's young. First time. Calf is positioned wrong and she's wearing out." Lydia was already moving toward the stall. She rolled her sleeves higher, which was already a significant achievement given that they were already rolled to the elbow, and looked at the heifer, a young red and white animal, maybe 3 years old, eyes showing white at the edges, flanks dark with sweat. "You've got soap and water somewhere?" Lydia asked. He pointed to a shelf. She was already washing her hands by the time he crossed the barn to the other side, watching her without being obvious about the fact that he was watching. She worked quietly and efficiently, getting down into the stall with the heifer, talking low and steady, not the bright performative talking that some people did with animals, but the genuine low murmur of someone who understood that what a frightened animal needed was not enthusiasm but presence, steadiness, the physical reassurance that whoever was here knew what they were doing and was not leaving. The heifer's ears moved toward the sound, and she stopped straining against nothing. Clayton stood at the stall gate. "Front legs are folded back," Lydia said, her voice still that same steady low. "She's been pushing against it for hours. No wonder she's worn out." She worked with careful hands. "I need you to keep her head calm while I correct the position." He didn't argue. He came into the stall and took the heifer's head, holding her still with the practiced grip of someone who had done exactly this many times before, and they worked together without further conversation because the situation didn't require it. The heifer bawled once, a raw, exhausted sound, and then Lydia had the calf repositioned, and the mother was doing the rest herself with a renewed urgency. And 8 minutes later a wet black calf lay in the straw, all knees and enormous liquid eyes, and Lydia was already clearing its face. Clayton exhaled. "Good," he said. It was, she would come to understand, one of his larger compliments. She wiped her hands and stood and looked at him over the back of the heifer. "What's next?" The next 3 days were the most relentless Lydia had experienced in several relentless years. Calving season in the Wyoming Territory in 1882 was not a gentle affair under any circumstances, but this particular spring had delivered a series of late storms that had lowered temperatures back to dangerous levels just as the herd was mid-cycle, and the combination of cold, mud, and the ordinary complications of new life had created a situation that required essentially constant presence. Lydia learned the ranch in the only way that actually worked, which was by doing everything on it simultaneously and at speed. There was a hand named Reuben Marsh, a compact and serious man of around 40 who had been with the Stone Ranch for 6 years and who greeted Lydia's arrival with a silence that could have meant disapproval or simply shock. Within a day, once he had watched her work, the silence shifted into something that felt more like respect, the quiet brand of it that men like Reuben gave out sparingly because they valued it. He had a bad shoulder from an old injury and wasn't able to do the heavy lifting that calving required, so he handled the horses and the equipment and the feeding, and the three of them established a rhythm that felt, by the end of the first full day, like it had been in place for months. Clayton's other regular hand, a young man named Tobias Wheeler who was barely 19 and who had an endearing terror of the larger bulls, had apparently taken off for Laramie 3 days before Lydia arrived and had not yet returned. Clayton mentioned this with the tone of a man who had ceased to be surprised by the unreliability of young men. "He'll come back broke and sheepish," Reuben said, pouring coffee at the small table in the ranch house kitchen on the evening of Lydia's first full day. He set a cup in front of her as naturally as if she had always sat at this table. Lydia was eating a bowl of beans and salt pork that Clayton had produced from the stove with the grim efficiency of a man who cooked because not eating was worse, not because he had any particular feeling about it. The food was plain and there was a lot of it, and it tasted extraordinarily good after 16 hours of physical work. "How many calves do you have on the ground?" she asked. 23 healthy, Clayton said from across the table. He had washed up, but he still looked like a man who had been awake for the better part of a week. "Lost 2 to the storm night before you arrived. Got another 15 or so still to come, including 4 I'm watching close." He looked at his coffee. "The late storm hit hard, weakened some of the cows that were close. The creek pasture fence needs checking," Lydia said. "I saw a section near the second bend that's leaning bad. If the mud keeps thawing that direction, you'll have cattle in the creek." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "Haven't had time. I can check it tomorrow morning before the first barn rounds if you point me to the tools." There was a pause, not a long one. "Tools are in the west outbuilding. You'll want the fence pliers and the staple box there on the middle shelf." Reuben Marsh said nothing, but he made a very small sound over his coffee cup that might have been approval. What Lydia did not expect in the crowded rush of those first days was the quality of Clayton Stone's silences. She had worked for many men over the past 2 years, and silence from an employer was usually either indifferent or hostile or both. Clayton's silences were different. They were attentive. When she spoke, he heard every word, even if he didn't respond to all of them. When she made a decision in the barn, he watched it play out before forming an opinion, and if the decision was right, he acknowledged it with that minimal nod or that brief "good" that she was beginning to understand was genuine. He did not tell her she was doing things wrong when she was doing them right. He did not take over her tasks. He worked beside her rather than over her, and that distinction meant more than she would have readily admitted to anyone. On the 4th day, Tobias Wheeler returned from Laramie looking exactly as Reuben Marsh had predicted, which was broke and sheepish, hat in hand both literally and otherwise. Clayton let the silence do its work for a long moment and then said calmly that the creek pasture fence needed mending and that Tobias could start on it immediately. Tobias nodded with the enthusiasm of a man grateful not to have been fired and went directly to the west outbuilding for tools. "You didn't fire him," Lydia said. "He's young," Clayton said. "Young men leave sometimes. They come back too, usually." He was checking the leg of a calf that had been showing a slight lameness since birth, running his hands down it with focused attention. Reuben left twice before he finally stayed. Reuben, who was within earshot, made no acknowledgement of this. Lydia found herself watching Clayton Stone with the kind of attention she ordinarily reserved for things that required careful study, weather patterns, animal behavior, terrain. There was something about him that she could not immediately categorize, which bothered her in the way that unsolved puzzles did. He was not particularly easy to read, but she had the growing sense that he was not trying to be difficult so much as he had simply learned not to offer himself too quickly to people who might not stay. The ranch itself told parts of his story that he didn't. The solid, careful construction of the outbuildings, the quality of the fencing in the areas that had been there longest versus the quick repairs made under pressure, the small kitchen garden plot beside the house, covered still with straw against the last of the frost that someone had taken trouble with at some point. The way Reuben moved around the property with the comfort of a man who genuinely belonged to a place, which said something about the man who ran it. She learned other things from Reuben, in the gradual way that conversation happened between two people working together on the same tasks without much need for ceremony. Clayton had come to this land in 1875, when he was 22, with a small inheritance from his father who had died in Missouri, and a stubbornness that Reuben described as being in the geological category. He had built the main house himself over 2 years, and the barn, and had run the operation alone for the first season before recognizing, with apparently considerable reluctance, that a man could not do all of it. He had been married once, briefly, to a woman named Cecilia Marsh, no relation to Reuben, that was a coincidence, who had arrived from the East with grand ideas about the frontier, and had discovered within 8 months that the frontier had no particular interest in anyone's ideas about it. She had gone back to Ohio in the fall of 1878, and Clayton had signed the papers without complaint and put his head back down and kept working. He was, Reuben said, not a man who stayed broken, but he was also not a man who rushed toward anything again. "Works too hard," Reuben said one afternoon, mending a length of leather harness with the focused patience of someone who had learned not to hurry things that couldn't be hurried. "Always has. Even when there's nothing pressing, he finds something to press. He seems like a man who knows what his land needs," Lydia said carefully. Reuben looked at her with the direct gaze of a man who missed very little. "He does," he said. "He needs someone to tell him it doesn't always need him at midnight, too." Lydia said nothing to that, and Reuben returned to his harness with what appeared to be a carefully neutral expression. The nights were still cold, deep cold in the hours before dawn that settled over the territory with an authority that no amount of spring optimism could argue with. Lydia slept in the small room at the back of the bunkhouse that Tobias had apparently used until she arrived, at which point Tobias moved to the main bunkhouse room with no apparent resentment. The room had a single window that faced east and a narrow iron stove that she kept low through the night. She lay in the dark in those brief hours between barn checks and listened to the sounds of the ranch, the horses shifting in the stable, the occasional low complaint of a cow, the wind moving through the pine brake on the north side, and thought about what she was doing and where she was, and whether the strange settled feeling she had in this place was real, or was only the relief of being employed and useful. She had not felt settled anywhere since Colorado. Since her father's ranch, before the bad winter and the bad partner had taken it. She pushed the thought away before it could go anywhere complicated, turned onto her side, and slept for 3 hours before the first alarm of a calf in distress pulled her back into the dark and the barn. The conversation that changed things between them happened on a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of April, after the worst of the calving was finished, and the herd was settling into the more ordinary demands of spring. Lydia was sitting on the top rail of the corral fence with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, watching the new calves work out the grammar of their bodies in the evening light. Clayton came out of the barn and stopped when he saw her, and then, instead of going back inside or across to the house, came and leaned against the same fence rail about 3 feet from where she was sitting. They were quiet for a while. The calves were entertaining all on their own. "How long are you planning on staying?" Clayton asked. His voice was entirely neutral, the way voices were when a person was trying to be neutral because they had a preference they weren't ready to show. Lydia considered the question. "How long do you need help?" "I always need help," he said. "That's not what I asked." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the calves, not at her, his profile serious and still in the low western light. "I don't have anywhere I'm expected," she said honestly. "I don't have anywhere else I want to be." Now he looked at her. The look was direct and considered, and it did something to the air between them that Lydia chose, for the moment, to leave unnamed. "That's a different thing from wanting to stay somewhere," he said. "I'm working on it," she said, which surprised her as it came out because it was more honest than she had intended. He looked back at the calves. "Pays fair," he said. "Not generous, but fair. Board and meals included, works hard and doesn't stop." "I noticed that," she said. "Reuben says I'm too hard to work for." "Reuben says you work too hard yourself," she said. "That's different." He was quiet for a moment. "He might not be wrong," he said, which appeared to cost him something to admit. "The ranch is good," Lydia said. She wasn't sure exactly what she meant by it, but she meant something true. "What you've built here is good. The quality of the herd, the condition of the land, the way it's set up. It's a serious operation." "It was always supposed to be," he said. And there was something in those words that carried the weight of everything he hadn't said, all the years of work, the partnership that had failed, the wife who had left, the seasons that had been won or lost by the narrowest margins. And still he was here, and still the ranch was here, and they had both survived it together. She understood that, actually. She understood it in her body the way she understood the lay of land from horseback instinctively, without having to translate it into words. "I'll stay through the summer," she said. "After that, we'll see what makes sense." He nodded once. "Good," he said. That was all. But when he pushed off the fence rail and walked toward the house, there was something in his gait that was slightly less contained than usual, and Lydia sat on the fence rail and finished her cold coffee and watched the calves and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like something was beginning rather than ending. May came in warm and fast, and the work shifted from the urgent intimacy of calving to the broader, harder work of the full ranch season. There were cattle to move to the upper pastures, fence lines to ride, a section of the barn roof that had developed an argument with the weather and needed arbitration. Tobias Wheeler, apparently determined to rehabilitate his reputation after the Laramie incident, threw himself into the work with an energy that was genuinely useful once directed at something productive, and Reuben managed the horses and the equipment with his usual quiet competence. Lydia worked wherever was needed, and increasingly found herself working alongside Clayton rather than separately from him, which she told herself was practical and efficient, and entirely without ulterior motive, a position she maintained with decreasing conviction as the weeks went on. She noticed things. She noticed that he was patient with his animals in a way that was not sentimental but was deeply respectful, the patience of someone who understood that animals were not here for human convenience, and that working with them rather than against them was both the ethical and the practical position. She noticed that he read actual books, kept on a shelf in the main room of the house, which surprised her and then made her wonder why it had. She noticed that he kept his word precisely, that if he said he would have something done by a certain time, it was done, and if he said he couldn't have it done, he said so plainly rather than making excuses later. She noticed that he laughed rarely but genuinely, a short contained sound that was somehow more satisfying than a louder man's easy laughter. He noticed things too, though he was harder to read. She caught him watching her sometimes with that careful, assessing look that he'd given her on that first morning, except that it had changed somewhat in quality, less the look of a man evaluating an employee, and more the look of a man trying to understand something that interested him very much and that he wasn't sure what to do about. In the middle of May, a man arrived at the Stone Ranch who Lydia recognized immediately, and whom she would have preferred not to encounter again under any circumstances. His name was Walker Pike, and he rode in on a spotted horse and wore his hat pushed forward in a way that he evidently thought was charming and that most people found threatening. He was 35 years old and had been, for a period of about 2 years, a neighboring rancher in the territory further east, and he had made a business of buying up land when operations failed, sometimes in ways that were not strictly above the board. Lydia had met him twice previously, once in Cheyenne and once in Casper, and both times he had looked at her in a way that she had not enjoyed. He arrived ostensibly to discuss a grazing rights agreement with Clayton regarding a stretch of land along the northern creek that bordered both their properties. Lydia was mending a saddle on the porch of the bunkhouse when he rode in, and she watched him take note of her with a sharpness that he tried to cover with a casual look around the property. "Langley," he said, when Clayton brought him past the bunkhouse on the way to the house. His voice was pleasantly neutral in the way that things were pleasantly neutral when the pleasantness was a performance. "Pike," she said, and returned to the saddle. The meeting took about an hour. When it was done and Pike had ridden back down the road, Clayton came and stood at the bunkhouse porch with an expression that she was beginning to be able to read. "He offered to buy out the northern grazing rights," Clayton said. "What did you say?" "I said they weren't for sale." "Good," she said. He watched her work on the saddle for a moment. "You know him." "Of him," she said. "He has a reputation for finding opportunities in other men's difficulties. He bought 2 operations in Converse County after the drought in '79 for prices that were considerably below what the land was worth." She looked up at Clayton. "He'll be back." "He will," Clayton agreed. "He's been coming around since January. The creek section is good land. He wants water access for his herd without the cost of maintaining the creek line." "Don't let him get a foothold," Lydia said. It was direct advice, possibly more direct than her position warranted, and she was aware of it as it came out. Clayton looked at her for a beat. "I wasn't planning on it," he said, and there was something in his voice that made clear he didn't mind the directness at all. She went back to the saddle. He went back to the barn. Reuben appeared from nowhere in particular, as he occasionally did, looked at the dust of Pike's departure in the distance, and said to no one specifically, "Coyote in a good coat," and then went back to wherever he'd come from. The evening of the 3rd week of May, after supper, Clayton brought a book out to the porch, and Lydia was already there with a cup of tea that Reuben had taught her to make with dried yarrow and honey. A frontier remedy for every complaint from headache to loneliness, and they sat in the cooling evening without immediate conversation, and it was entirely comfortable, which was itself remarkable. Lydia had never been particularly easy in silence with anyone. She tended to fill it or to feel the pressure of it, the social expectation that silence was a gap to be bridged. But there was nothing gap-like about this silence. It was its own kind of communication. "What are you reading?" she asked eventually. He held the cover toward her. It was a worn copy of a George Eliot novel. She raised an eyebrow, not disparagingly but genuinely surprised. "My mother sent it," he said, with the faint self-consciousness of a man who would not have offered that information voluntarily but would not lie about it either. "She sends books every few months. She thinks I'm lonely." "Are you?" Lydia asked. Then immediately, "You don't have to answer that." "I know," he said. He looked at the book for a moment. "I've been less lonely lately," he said, with a plainness that was clearly intentional. He was not a man who said things accidentally. Lydia looked at the darkening mountains to the west and took a sip of her yarrow tea and felt something warm and careful opening in her chest like a window being pushed just slightly ajar. "Me too," she said. They stayed on that porch until the stars came out thick over the Wyoming sky, and when Lydia finally went in, she lay in her narrow bunkhouse room and thought about a man reading George Eliot on a ranch porch at the end of a 17-hour work day and felt, against all her better instincts, thoroughly and hopelessly charmed. June arrived with heat and the full density of ranch work that came with summer. There were cattle to brand, the late calves that had been born after the main season push, and a stock sale in Laramie that required preparation and the selecting of animals, and the particular theater of cattle commerce that Lydia had watched her father conduct with the serious dignity of a man who understood that the way you presented your stock said something about everything you stood for. She attended the sale with Clayton and Reuben as a matter of practical necessity, which she acknowledged to herself honestly meant that she wanted to be there. She wanted to see how he conducted himself in public, in commerce, away from the ranch. He was good. He was direct and honest without being naive, and he had a composure in negotiation that she recognized as genuine rather than performed, because it didn't vary whether the offer was good or bad. He sold 32 head at prices that were fair to exceptional, depending on the animal, and he didn't oversell a single one. When a buyer from a large operation out of Nebraska tried to pressure him on the price of a particularly fine young bull, Clayton simply looked at the man and said, pleasantly, that the animal was worth what he was asking, and that the buyer was welcome to agree or to pass, and the buyer agreed. "You're good at that," Lydia said on the ride back, when the wagon was rolling easily in the early afternoon light, and Reuben had fallen asleep in the back in the way that men who had been up since 3 in the morning had every right to do. "My father was better," Clayton said. He could look a man in the eye and know exactly how much that man actually wanted what he was selling. He always said that the negotiation was over before the first word was said. You just had to be paying attention. "He sounds like he was a good man." "He was," Clayton said. The simplicity of it carried everything. Lydia was quiet for a moment. The road ran between high sage-covered slopes, and the sky above was a blue so pure it looked manufactured. "My father was too," she said. "He was too trusting, which is what undid him in the end, but he was fundamentally a good man. He believed people meant well unless they showed you otherwise." "What happened to him?" "A partner who didn't mean well," she said. "He'd gone into a land deal with a man named Forsyth, who turned out to have already mortgaged his portion of the property without my father knowing. When the debt came due, Forsyth was gone and my father owned a property with a lien on it that he couldn't meet." She kept her eyes on the road. "We lost the ranch in the spring of '80. He died that fall. I've always thought the land broke his heart as much as the pneumonia." Clayton didn't say anything immediately. He let the words settle the way he did with things that mattered, letting them take their actual weight rather than rushing to reduce it with comfort. "I'm sorry," he said at last. "That kind of loss is different. It's not just the land, it's what the land means." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly it." He kept his eyes on the road, and she kept hers on his face for a moment longer, studying the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the way he held the reins with the easy practice of a man who had driven this road 1,000 times, and something in her chest that had been very carefully locked for a very long time made a sound like a latch lifting. She made herself look away before she said anything she wasn't ready to say. Reuben snored once, luxuriously from the back of the wagon, and the moment dissolved into something lighter, and she was grateful for it. On a Saturday in the second week of June, there was a small gathering in town, the kind that happened periodically in Laramie, where people who had been working in isolation for months came together in the general store's back room, or the saloon's less disreputable corner, to exchange information and company. Lydia went because Reuben persuaded her, and because she had been working without pause since April, and because there was a specific form of social isolation that the frontier imposed on women doing men's work, and she needed, occasionally, to remember that she was also a person who could have a conversation that wasn't about fence lines. She wore a clean dress, which she owned exactly one of and which she had pressed that morning with the flat iron heated on the stove. It was a dark green wool with a high collar, and she was aware, when she came out of the bunkhouse and found Clayton waiting at the hitching post with the wagon, that he looked at her for a beat too long and then looked very deliberately at the horses. "You look different," Tobias Wheeler said helpfully from his position, already seated in the wagon bed. "Thank you, Tobias," Lydia said. It wasn't exactly Tobias began, but Reuben stepped on his foot, and the sentence ended there. Clayton said nothing, but he offered her his hand to step up to the wagon seat, which he had not done any of the previous times she had ridden in the wagon wearing work clothes, and his hand was warm and certain around hers, and he held it just a half-second longer than purely necessary. The gathering was pleasant in the uncomplicated way of people happy to be together after months of their own company. There were families from 3 other ranches, a pair of freight operators, the local doctor and his wife, a woman named Helen Garrett who ran the only dressmaking operation in Laramie and who took an immediate and warm interest in Lydia, and a minister named Carey whose sermon delivery was reportedly dire but whose social conversation was genuinely enjoyable. The women gathered in one half of the room and the men in the other, roughly, which was the social habit of the time, but Lydia moved between the two with a comfortable fluidity that came from years of being in neither camp exclusively. She was talking to Helen Garrett about the challenge of finding good wool fabric west of the Missouri River when Walker Pike walked in. He had not been expected. He was not unwelcome enough to be asked to leave. He moved through the room with the smooth comfort of a man who was used to being received everywhere, exchanged pleasantries with the freight operators, accepted a whiskey from the saloon's contribution to the evening, and eventually made his way to where Lydia was standing. "Miss Langley," he said. "Didn't expect to see you here. Last I heard you were pulling calves in the stone barn." "Mr. Pike," she said. Helen Garrett, to her credit, did not move away. "I hear you've made yourself quite indispensable up at Stone's place," Pike said. His tone was pleasant in the surface way, but there was something underneath it that she had learned to hear. "Smart of Stone to find good help. He's going to need it if the summer stays dry." "The summer hasn't decided what it's going to do yet," Lydia said. "No," he agreed, "but the creek's been running lower than usual. If that continues and the grazing on the upper pastures dries out, Stone's going to have a real problem come August." He swirled his glass. He might be more open to a reasonable conversation about those Northern Creek rights by then. Lydia held his gaze with the steady, unconcerned look she had developed over years of being told no in various creative ways. "Or he might not be," she said pleasantly. Pike smiled with his mouth. "You're loyal," he said. "That's an admirable quality in an employee." She smiled back with an equal lack of warmth and turned back to Helen Garrett, who had watched the whole exchange with bright, attentive eyes and made no pretense of having missed a word of it. "That man," Helen said quietly when Pike had moved on, "has been trying to buy up every piece of land that runs along that creek for 2 years. He ran one family off last winter, the Henrys. Cold, dry spell, offered them a price for their grazing rights that they couldn't refuse, and then used the water access to run cattle that damaged the downstream banks. The next family below had a terrible spring because of it." "I know his type," Lydia said. "I imagine you do," Helen said approvingly. On the wagon ride home, Tobias asleep again in the back, Reuben riding his own horse at a contemplative distance, Clayton said without preamble, "What did Pike say to you?" "That you might be more interested in selling the Northern Creek rights if the summer goes dry. He's wrong. I told him that." Another silence. The stars were extraordinary. The road was silver in the moonlight. "Thank you," he said. It was quiet and direct and genuine. "He's the kind of trouble that doesn't advertise itself," she said. "He'll come at you sideways, make sure your land papers are in order and your grazing agreements are documented properly." He glanced at her. "You know a lot about this kind of thing." "I watched it happen to my father," she said. "Forsyth wasn't dramatically villainous. He was just quietly dishonest and patient about it. By the time my father understood what was happening, it was already done." She looked at the road. "I've never forgotten the look on his face when he finally understood. I would do a lot to keep from seeing that look on someone else's face." She wasn't entirely sure why she said that last part. It was more than the professional concern of an employee. She knew it was more than that. He knew it too, she suspected, from the quality of the silence that followed, which was not simply the silence of 2 people riding at night, but the silence of 2 people aware of each other in a way that had crossed some invisible line. "Lydia," he said, and then stopped. She waited. "The summer stay," he said finally. "The one that extends past whatever we agreed to initially." He kept his eyes on the road. "I'd like that to happen." She was quiet for a moment, feeling the weight of the words, the careful underdressed way he had said what he was saying without quite saying it. And she thought about the ranch and the calves and the porch and the book and the wagon seat, and the way her name had sounded in his voice just then. And she thought about her father's land and her father's face, and the 2 years of being entirely untethered and entirely competent and entirely alone. "So would I," she said. Nothing more was said, but when they reached the ranch and he helped her down from the wagon, his hands were at her waist and he didn't step back immediately when she reached the ground, and they stood in the dark yard for a moment close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. And then Tobias Wheeler fell out of the wagon bed with a sound like a sack of feed, and the moment broke and they both stepped back, and Lydia went to help Tobias determine if he'd broken anything, which he hadn't. And Clayton laughed, actually laughed, the real brief laughter she had only heard a handful of times, and the whole night ended in something lighter and better than anything she'd had in years. July brought the heat Pike had predicted, dry and pressing, and the creek did run lower, but not dangerously so, and Clayton had already ridden the upper pastures and made arrangements to rotate the cattle through the sections with better grass retention, rather than concentrating them on the drying sections. Lydia had helped plan the rotation, sitting with him at the kitchen table over a rough sketch of the property that he drew from memory with the easy accuracy of a man who had walked every foot of it, and she had suggested shifting the timing based on what she had seen up in Montana in a similar dry summer, and he had listened and adjusted, and the cattle were better for it. It was during the July pasture rotation that the thing with the fence happened, which was both moderately dangerous and the occasion of the first moment between them that was entirely and irrevocably something more than professional. They had ridden out to the far northwest corner of the property to check on a section of fence that Tobias had reported as unstable after a particularly dramatic rainstorm the week before. It was a long ride, nearly 2 hours from the main ranch through country that was beautiful and indifferent in the way that Wyoming rangeland was beautiful, vast and rolling, and utterly uninterested in anyone's opinion of it. They rode mostly in comfortable silence, the horses moving easy in the morning cool, and Lydia allowed herself the luxury of simply being in the landscape for the duration of the ride, which was a luxury she had learned to take when it presented itself. The fence section was worse than Tobias had made it sound. A runoff channel from the rain had undermined 3 consecutive posts, and the whole stretch had tilted at a drunken angle that a determined steer would have walked through without noticing. The problem with a determined steer going through there was that the far side of this fence was a steep rocky slope that dropped off into a gully, and anything that went through the fence was going to have a bad afternoon. They dismounted and assessed, and Clayton said with the resigned calm of a man who had been surprised by exactly this kind of thing many times, "Well, we're spending the day here." They had tools in the saddlebags because he always brought tools, which was the kind of preparedness that Lydia had come to expect from him, and which she found unreasonably attractive. They worked through the morning, resetting the posts with the rock lever and the hand drill and the wire stretcher, and it was hard physical work in the building heat of the July day, and they were both thoroughly dirty and entirely focused by the time noon arrived. He had brought food, cornbread and dried beef, and a canteen of water and 2 apples that were slightly soft but entirely welcome. They sat in the shade of a large juniper that overhung a flat rock and ate without ceremony, and the work silence between them softened into the other kind of silence, the comfortable, companionable kind. "My mother used to make better cornbread than this," Clayton said, looking at the piece in his hand. "How does it fall short?" "She put honey in it and it had a proper crust. He ate the piece anyway. She keeps writing to ask me to come home for the winter." He paused. "Back to Missouri." "Are you going to?" "No," he said. He said it in the way that made clear it was not an agonizing decision, just a statement of fact. "This is home." Lydia looked at the sweep of land below them, the cattle small as dots in the middle distance, the mountains blue and precise against the hard July sky. "I know exactly what you mean," she said. He looked at her. "Do you? You don't have to stay, Lydia. You said yourself you don't have anywhere expected." "I said I didn't have anywhere I was expected," she said. "I didn't say anywhere didn't feel right." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the deliberateness of a man who thought before he spoke and when he spoke meant it, he said, "Does somewhere feel right?" She met his gaze. His eyes were the gray-brown of creek water over stone, steady and serious, and something else that she had been carefully not naming for 2 months. "Yes," she said. He reached out and picked a piece of juniper bark off her sleeve with a gentleness that was so disproportionate to the size of the gesture that she felt it in her spine. His fingers brushed her arm and didn't immediately retreat. "I don't do things quickly," he said. "You should know that. I mean it the other way too. When I'm sure of something, I'm sure." She turned her hand over so that her fingers were near his. "I'm not in a hurry," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." His hand covered hers, and they sat there in the shade of the juniper, with the Wyoming mountains watching and the cattle grazing far below. And nothing dramatic happened, and nothing needed to, because the two of them holding hands on a flat rock in the middle of a work day felt more significant than anything dramatic could have been. They rode back in the long, golden late afternoon with the fence mended and the horses lazy in the heat, riding close enough that their knees nearly touched. And when they came into the ranch yard and Reuben looked up from the harness he was repairing and took in the quality of the silence between them, he put the harness down and went into the house and put the coffee on, because some things required acknowledgement, and Reuben Marsh expressed acknowledgement in the form of coffee. August came in with the dry heat still holding, and Walker Pike made his next move, which was not dramatic but was characteristically quiet and thorough. He had apparently filed a claim with the Territorial Land Office that there was a disputed boundary on the northwest corner of the Stone Ranch, precisely the area where the fence section had been undermined by the rain, as it happened based on an old survey that predated the current property lines. The claim was likely groundless. Clayton's attorney in Laramie confirmed after looking at the original deed documents, but it would require formal response and possibly a survey, which cost money and time. Clayton heard the news from the attorney on a Wednesday and came back to the ranch with the flat, controlled look he had when he was genuinely angry, but was not going to allow the anger to determine his actions. He sat at the kitchen table with the documents and a cup of coffee and went through everything methodically, and Lydia sat across from him not to help specifically, but because she understood that sometimes what a person needed when they were dealing with a serious problem was another person at the table who was also taking it seriously. "He's buying time," she said, when he had laid out the situation. "The claim won't hold, but the process takes months. In the meantime, if you have to focus resources on the legal defense, you're less able to develop that northwest section." "I know," he said. He might also be hoping the cost of the legal process makes you reconsider selling the creek rights. He can keep hoping. Clayton looked at the documents. "I need to send a formal response within 30 days and commission a new survey. The survey alone will run $40. "Which you have," she said, because she had worked here long enough to have a sense of the finances. "Which I have," he agreed. "That's not the problem. The problem is the time and the distraction during a season that doesn't have room for it." She thought for a moment. "You know who did the original survey in this section? There might be records at the land office that were filed at the same time as the original deed. Sometimes the boundary markers from the original survey are still physically present, which would make the new survey faster and cheaper if they can be located." He looked at her with the particular attention he gave things that were useful. "Where did you learn about surveying?" "My father filed 2 property expansions when I was about 12, she said. "I helped him walk the boundary lines. He explained everything as we went. He was good at explaining things." She paused. "There's a survey marker post on the northwest corner. I saw it when we were mending the fence. It's got a brass cap on it. If it's an original marker, it predates Pike's survey, and it establishes the boundary definitively." Clayton was looking at her in a way she was starting to recognize. It was the look he had when something she said both solved a problem and on some other level affected him in a way that had nothing to do with the problem. He managed that look for a moment and then said, "You saw that and remembered it." "I remember land," she said simply. They rode out to the northwest corner the following morning, just the two of them, and found the Brass Gap survey post exactly where Lydia had described it, set 3 feet into the ground and bearing a marking number that, when Clayton sent a description to his attorney in Laramie, matched the original 1875 land survey registered with the territorial office. The post had been there for 7 years. It was not disputed. It resolved the boundary question completely, and the attorney wrote a response to the land office that was apparently thorough enough to cause Pike's claim to be dismissed within 6 weeks, without requiring a new survey at all. Walker Pike did not return to the Stone Ranch after that. He turned his attentions elsewhere, to other properties, other opportunities, and the land along the northern creek remained exactly as it had always been, belonging entirely to Clayton Stone, with its water and its banks and its good grass all intact. The evening after they received the attorney's letter confirming the dismissal of the claim, Clayton came to find Lydia in the barn where she was finishing the evening feed rounds. He stood in the barn doorway for a moment, the golden light of the late August afternoon behind him, the lantern light inside turning the straw amber and the shadows warm, and she looked up from the hay fork and found him watching her with that look, the particular one. "Claims dismissed," he said. "I heard," she said. She had gotten the letter from Reuben. "You found that survey post," he said. "Without that post we're in months of legal maneuvering. You would have found it." "I don't know that," he said. "I wasn't looking for survey posts when I mended that fence. I was looking at the fence." She set the hay fork against the wall and walked toward him, because he was standing in the doorway and not coming in, which was the closest she had seen him to uncertain about where he stood, and she found it, in its strange way, the most appealing thing about him. She stopped when she was close enough to see the particular color of his eyes in the late light. "Clayton," she said. "Yes," he said, not answering a question, just acknowledging that he was here and present and aware of what was happening. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, the rough jaw of a man who had been working since before dawn, and he closed his eyes for a half-second and then opened them again and looked at her with everything he had. "I'd like you to stay," he said, "not as a ranch hand." "I know," she said. "I'd like you to stay as everything," he said. "That's what I mean, all of it." It was not technically a romantic speech. It was not poetry. It was the exact way Clayton Stone said the most important things, directly, plainly, with the full weight of his meaning behind every word and nothing decorative to distract from it. She stood on her toes and kissed him, and he kissed her back with a careful and thorough attention that was entirely in keeping with everything else about him. And the barn smelled of hay, and the August evening came in warm through the open door, and somewhere outside a calf called for its mother and got an answer. Reuben Marsh, who had absolutely not been walking past the barn door, appeared from nowhere approximately 3 seconds later, looked at them, turned around immediately, and walked back the way he had not been coming from. The last weeks of August and the early fall were the best Lydia had known in her adult life. The work continued. It always continued. That was the nature of ranching. There was never a point at which everything was done and you could rest completely. But it was different work now, or rather it was the same work experienced differently, with the warmth between them giving everything a quality she hadn't expected. She had not been afraid of hard work or solitude. She had never been those things, but she understood now, in the way you only understood things by contrast, how much lighter even the hard work was when you carried it alongside someone who was genuinely with you. They talked. Not always about large things, but constantly, in the woven-through way that two people developed when they spent most of their waking hours in proximity, and found that they liked what the other person thought about everything from cattle rotation strategy to the proper way to make cornbread to whether the mountains in the distance were the same color every day or different in ways that were worth noticing. He told her things about himself that he had apparently not told many people, and she understood, given what she knew about how he operated, that this was not a small thing. He told her about building the ranch house alone, the 2 winters of it, how some days the loneliness of the project had been so physical it was like weather. He told her about Cecilia and the failure of that marriage in the honest way of someone who was not assigning all the blame outward. He said, plainly, that he had not known then how to be both a full person and a good husband, that he had given the ranch everything and had expected a wife to fit herself around the remainder, and that it had not been fair, and that he had taken a long time to understand that. She told him about her father and the land in the 2 years since, about the particular brand of competence that had become her identity when there was nothing else to organize herself around, and about the loneliness of that which she had not previously admitted to herself was loneliness, had classified it instead as independence, because independence was something to be proud of and loneliness was not. "You could have both," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm starting to understand that." September brought the cooling of the air and the particular clarity of the Wyoming fall, when the light went gold and thin, and everything on the land stood out in a sharpness that felt almost editorial, as if nature was making sure you saw things clearly before winter came and covered them. The cattle were fat from the summer pastures and in excellent condition. The calves from the spring were growing strong. The herd was better than the previous year by any measure, and Clayton said so. In the understated way he said things, looking over the cattle one morning in the first frost of the season, and Lydia understood that the compliment was partly hers because she had earned it. He proposed to her on a Sunday in early October. Not in town, not with theater, not with anything she might have expected, because he was not a man for theater. He took her up to the northwest corner on horseback, the repaired fence section, the juniper flat rock, the survey post standing in the low golden grass, and they dismounted, and she thought they were just out for a ride together on one of the increasingly rare purely free days. And then he turned to face her with the particular quality of attention that she had come to know meant he was about to say something that he meant absolutely. He didn't get down on one knee. He stood facing her, straight and solid and entirely present, and he said, "I want to marry you, Lydia. I want you to be my wife and my partner in everything, and I want to build something here with you that lasts beyond both of us. That's what I want. I understand if it's not what you want or if it's not the time, and I won't." She stopped him mid-sentence by taking both his hands. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes. I've been waiting for weeks for you to get around to this." He blinked once, and then remarkably he laughed. A full, genuine laugh. Not the short, contained sound she'd become accustomed to, but a real one. And he pulled her to him, and she went with no hesitation whatsoever, and they stood on that northwest corner with the brass survey post at their backs, and the mountains watching, and the first cold breath of October on the air. And she thought that her father would have liked this land and this man enormously, and felt the particular bittersweet brightness that came with knowing something wonderful was also a thing someone you loved couldn't see. They married in November in Laramie, at the small church on Main Street, with Reuben Marsh as a witness and Helen Garrett on the other side and Tobias Wheeler in the front pew looking unexpectedly moved, and the minister named Carey delivering a ceremony that was, as previously advertised, somewhat lacking in oratory but was warm and genuine where it counted. Lydia wore the dark green dress with her mother's silver brooch pinned at the collar. Her mother, Ruth, had come up from Denver on the stage and cried the entire ceremony, and then recovered sufficiently at the small reception afterward to tell Clayton in considerable detail about the qualities she expected in a son-in-law, none of which, Ruth allowed, he appeared to be lacking. Clayton stood through this assessment with the patient composure of a man who had determined that this was worth whatever it required, and who was, Lydia could see, genuinely moved by Ruth Langley's approval in the way that men who had lost their own parents were moved by the parents of the person they loved. He kissed his new wife outside the church in the November cold with his hands cupped around her face, and the mountains at his back and their breath rising white in the clear air. And Reuben Marsh, watching, put his hands in his pockets and looked at the sky with the expression of a man who found the whole of it entirely satisfactory. The first winter of their marriage was a good one. Not easy Wyoming winters in 1882 and into 1883 were not constructed for ease but good, in the warm inner sense of the word. The house was different with two people in it. Lydia didn't change everything, didn't impose a domestic authority she'd never claimed, but she brought herself into the space with a completeness that gradually and naturally shifted the quality of it. She added things to the kitchen that she knew how to cook. She maintained the kitchen garden through the fall, preparing it properly for winter and planning the spring expansion. She wrote to her mother, long letters, and received long letters back, and sometimes in the evenings read aloud to Clayton from these letters, because his own letter writing was sparse and second-hand accounts of Denver social life were genuinely entertaining. He, in turn, read aloud from whatever book he was working through, and she discovered that hearing him read, his low, unhurried voice moving through the language with a kind of respectful attention, was one of her favorite things. Reuben Marsh spent the worst of the winter nights in the main house, at Clayton's long-standing invitation, rather than the bunkhouse, which would have been cold and lonely. And this arrangement continued into the new pattern of things without disruption, because Reuben was the kind of person who was simply present in a place the way furniture was present, not because he had been placed, but because he belonged there. Tobias Wheeler left in the spring of 1883 with the ambition of starting his own operation somewhere to the north, and they sent him off with good wishes and a small practical loan that Clayton said was not necessary to repay, but which Tobias would repay anyway in 2 years, on a Tuesday, appearing at the ranch with exact change and a new confidence that sat well on him. The spring of 1883 brought its own calving season, and Lydia pulled calves again in the dark hours and the cold mornings, and knew every animal in the herd by now with the intimacy of long acquaintance. She also pulled something else in that spring, which was the knowledge that she was expecting her first child, which she confirmed to herself on a Thursday in March with the certainty of a woman who had been paying close attention to her own body, and which she told Clayton on a Friday evening after supper, watching his face as she said it. His face went through several things: surprise, and then a stillness that was profound, not the controlled stillness of his professional composure, but the stillness of a man genuinely struck by something, and then something else that she had no good word for except that it was unmistakably joy, the kind that arrived before a person had time to moderate it. He crossed the kitchen floor and pulled her into his arms and held her with a gentleness that was different from all the other kinds of tenderness between them, more careful, more wondering, and said nothing for a long moment. "I didn't know I wanted this," he said, quietly, against her hair. "I mean, I knew in the abstract. But I didn't know it like this." She laughed against his shoulder. "I know exactly what you mean." He held her face and looked at her with the serious, full look that was his most intimate expression, the one he reserved for things that mattered enormously, and said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I've been pulling calves since February. I think I'm fine." He looked momentarily alarmed. I've been pulling calves since I was 14, she said. "It's fine, Clayton." He processed this with visible effort. "Still," he said. "Still nothing," she said. "I'm not made of glass." He knew this to be true. He worried anyway, which she accepted as the expression of love that it was, and she allowed him to worry to a reasonable degree and declined to pretend she needed to be managed. And they found, as they had found with everything, a balance that worked for both of them. Ruth Langley came up from Denver in June and stayed through the summer, which was the best thing and also occasionally the most demanding thing, because Ruth had opinions about everything from the positioning of the kitchen garden to the proper way to prepare a milk cow for weaning, and she expressed these opinions freely, warmly, and at length. Clayton took his mother-in-law's opinions with a good humor that endeared him to Ruth enormously, and that Lydia found endlessly funny. The house was loud and full in a way it had never been, and at night, when Ruth and the sound had gone quiet, Lydia lay in the dark listening to Clayton's breathing and felt the quiet density of her life, all its weight and warmth and particularity, and thought, with a completeness that surprised her every time, that she was genuinely, unmistakably happy. Their son was born in October of 1883, on a Thursday morning after a labor that was, as Lydia dryly described it afterward, considerably more work than any calving she had ever managed. He was large and loud and possessed of an extraordinary amount of dark hair and the gray-brown eyes of his father, and Clayton held him with the careful reverence of a man handling something he was afraid of breaking, until the baby grabbed his finger with a grip that was, by any measure, absurdly strong, and then he laughed, and Ruth Langley cried, and the doctor from Laramie who had attended the birth gathered his things with the brisk satisfaction of a man whose morning had gone well. They named him Gerald for Lydia's father, and Clayton said the name with the warmth of someone honoring a debt to a man he had never met. The years that followed were built of the same materials, land and work and weather, and the slow accumulation of things tended well. The ranch grew steadily, not explosively but in the solid incremental way of a well-managed operation, acquiring adjacent grazing sections when they became available at fair prices, improving the breeding stock, developing a reputation in the territory for the quality of the cattle produced and for the fairness of their business dealings, which was a reputation Clayton had worked for from the beginning and which Lydia reinforced simply by being exactly who she was, which was a person who said what she meant and meant what she said and expected the same. A daughter arrived in the spring of 1885, born in April when the calves were coming and the mud was deep, and the world was the same noisy, striving, magnificent place it had always been. They named her Clara, after Clayton's mother in Missouri, and she had Lydia's eyes and her grandmother Clayton's quick attention, and from the first months of her life seemed to find everything genuinely interesting, which was a quality Lydia recognized and felt a specific pride in. Reuben Marsh's shoulder got worse with the years, as old injuries did, until the heavy work became beyond him, but he stayed on the Stone Ranch because it was his home, and because Clayton would no more have asked him to leave than he would have asked the mountains to relocate. He shifted gradually into a role that had no precise name, part foreman, part counselor, part institutional memory, and managed the younger hands they hired with a quiet authority that was entirely convincing. He taught young Gerald to read a horse's gait at 4 years old, and young Clara to identify cloud formations at 3, and he sat on the porch in the evenings with the particular ease of a man who had found the place he belonged and stopped moving. On a September evening in 1886, Lydia stood at the northwest corner of the Stone Ranch, their ranch, fully theirs in all the ways that mattered, watching the sun go down behind the mountains. She was 30 years old. Gerald was nearly 3, asleep back at the house with his grandmother Ruth, who had come up from Denver for the autumn visit. Clara was 18 months and had been very firm about walking on her own 2 feet to this exact spot, and had managed 3/4 of the way before exhaustion, and the good sense God gave toddlers had combined to result in her being carried on her father's shoulders, where she now sat with her small hands twisted into his hair, very serious about the sunset. Clayton stood beside Lydia with his hands in his pockets and the particular settled look that she had learned to love best, the look of a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be, who knew it, and who was not taking it for granted. The survey post stood in the grass nearby, still upright, brass cap catching the last of the light. The creek ran full and clean in the distance, theirs in every sense. The calves born that spring were fat and growing in the lower pasture. The fence line was sound. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd said no? Lydia asked. It was not an anxious question. It was the comfortable philosophical question of a woman who already knew the answer. Which time, he said. She looked at him. When I rode up that first morning. He thought about it with the seriousness he gave all questions. No, he said. I think I knew the minute I saw you. I had mud on my boots, she said. My sleeves were already rolled. Yes, he said, and his voice had the warmth in it that still, after 4 years, moved through her like good news. That's exactly how I knew. She took his hand and leaned against him, and Clara said from above them, in the clear, imperious voice of a child who had decided the current conversation was less interesting than the thing she had noticed, "Papa, bird." There was indeed a hawk riding the last thermal of the evening above them, wide-winged and unhurried, the mountains red behind it, and the great Wyoming sky going from gold to indigo around it, and the land below it going on and on, enormous and alive. Yes, Clayton said, tilting his head back to look at his daughter who was looking at the hawk with her mother's direct, interested eyes. That's a red-tailed hawk. See how wide his wings are. Wide, Clara agreed, satisfied. Lydia watched the hawk and felt her husband's hand warm around hers and heard, distant but clear, the sound of cattle settling into the evening quiet, and she thought about arrival and departure, and the way some places called you back even when you hadn't known they were calling. And she thought about a morning in April 1882, when she had ridden up a muddy road on a Grella horse with her sleeves already rolled, and her boots already dirty, and her whole life balanced on whether a rancher she had never met would look at what she was offering and recognize it for what it was. He had. He had looked at her, at the mud and the rolled sleeves and the directness of her gaze, and he had said simply, "You start today," which was the smallest and also the most important thing anyone had ever said to her, because it had assumed without hesitation that she was capable of exactly what she had come to do. It had not questioned or demurred or tried to fit her into a category she didn't belong in. It had simply said, "Yes, start now. Do the work. This is a place where what you are is worth something." She had started that day. She had never stopped. The hawk banked on the thermal and rode it higher, and the mountains held the last red light of the September sun. And behind them, the ranch house windows were beginning to glow with the lamp that Reuben always lit at dusk, and somewhere inside a small boy was asleep with his grandmother's hand on his back, and the cattle were settled and the fence was sound, and the creek ran clear, and the land they stood on was theirs, built by work and kept by honesty, and made into something real by the unplanned and unstoppable fact of two people who had found each other at the right moment and recognized, against all odds and without much ceremony, exactly what they had. Clayton raised Lydia's hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles with the quiet sincerity that was his most characteristic way of saying the things that exceeded words. She turned and looked at him in the fading light, this man she had married in the mud and the work and the Wyoming cold, and felt the full settled weight of a life that had arrived at something genuine. "You start today," she said softly, testing the words. He looked at her, curious. "That's what you said that first morning," she said. He thought about it, the corner of his mouth moved. "Best thing I ever said." She laughed, and Clara, from her perch on his shoulders, laughed because her mother laughed, and the sound of it went out over the stone ranch in the evening air, over the fence and the creek and the long good grass. And the hawk turned once more above them, and then rode the thermal up and away into the enormous Wyoming sky. And the stars came out, and the lamps burned in the windows, and the stone ranch settled into its evening with the quiet assurance of a place that knew what it was and what it held, and had no intention of letting go. The years continued to write themselves onto the land and onto the people who loved it. In the spring of 1888, another child arrived, a second son they named James, dark-haired like his father with a temperament so serene that Lydia spent the first 3 months of his life half convinced she was imagining it. He proved, as he grew, to be genuinely that way, deliberate, thoughtful, unflappable in the way that middle children sometimes were, as though they had arrived having already calculated the emotional weather of the household and decided to balance it. Gerald at 5 was beginning to understand horses in the specific way that Lydia had always hoped to see in her children, not as large animals to be managed, but as particular individuals with their own characters and preferences. And he took Reuben's lessons about gait and temperament with a focused attention that made Reuben nod to himself with satisfaction. Clara at 3 was already following her mother through the barn with a purposefulness that was almost comically determined. A tiny person with strong opinions about which calves required more attention and which hay needed rearranging. And Clayton watched his daughter conduct the barn with the expression of a man experiencing something wonderful that he hadn't prepared for and was grateful for that fact. Reuben's shoulder eventually required a serious conversation with the doctor in Laramie, who said what everyone already knew, which was that the old injury had developed into something that would not improve and that needed to be accommodated. Clayton had the conversation with Reuben in the main room of the house, just the two of them, and the outcome of it was that Reuben's responsibilities shifted further toward the organizational and supervisory, and a new young hand named Martin Cross was hired to do the physical work that Reuben could no longer manage. Martin was 20 and from Nebraska and was serious and capable, and treated Reuben with the specific respect that suggested he had understood immediately who the institutional knowledge of this ranch lived in. The summer of 1889 was the summer Wyoming achieved statehood, which was the occasion of considerable celebration in Laramie and throughout the territory, now the state of Wyoming. Clayton and Lydia rode into town for the celebration with the children, Gerald at 6 on his own small horse, Clara at 4 held securely in front of her mother on Petra's successor, a younger Grulla mare they had named Petra II as a matter of habit, and James at 1 in a cloth carrier at Clayton's chest, awake and extremely interested in everything. The streets were loud and flag-hung, and the whole of it had the quality of a community recognizing itself, which was something worth witnessing. Helen Garrett had decorated her shop with bunting and stood on the walk in front of it looking thoroughly satisfied. She had been instrumental in a petition the previous year regarding the rights of women in the new state, which Wyoming had in fact enshrined. Wyoming women had held the right to vote in territorial elections since 1869, a fact that was remarkable by any measure and that Lydia had exercised in every election since her arrival, which she considered both a civic duty and a pleasure. "The state is official," Helen said when they stopped to speak. She was beaming. "It's real now. It's ours." "It's always been ours," Lydia said, and meant the land itself and the life built on it and the work that had made it mean something. On the ride home, with the children variously asleep and awake in their various configurations, Clayton said, quietly so as not to disturb Gerald, who had fallen asleep in his saddle in the way of exhausted small boys, "My father would never have believed it, coming out here to start over and watching it become something." "It already was something," Lydia said. "You made it more." He looked at her with the full, steady look. "We," he said. She inclined her head. "We," she agreed. The land rolled away on all sides, Wyoming now in every official sense as well as every real one, and the evening came down warm and full of the sound of summer insects and distant cattle and the breathing of horses and children. And Clayton Stone and Lydia Langley Stone rode home along the road she had first ridden 7 years before with mud on her boots and her sleeves already rolled. And the road was still muddy in the spring and dry in the summer and frozen in the winter. And the ranch was at the end of it every time, solid and lit and waiting, as it always had been, as she knew now it always would be. And when they came through the gate and Reuben was on the porch with the coffee already on and Martin Cross had the horses ready to receive, and the lamps in the house were warm in the windows, and Gerald woke up just enough to be carried inside without protest, and Clara slid off the horse into her father's arms with the absolute trust of a child who had never been dropped, Lydia stood for a moment in the yard before going in, looking at all of it. The house and the barn and the work of years made into something that held, and she felt the old words rise up in her chest like something still alive. You start today. She had. She had never stopped, and she was, in every possible sense of the word, home.